The blood pooled black against the marble floor of the cryptoporticus, mixing with shadows cast by flickering oil lamps. 30 wounds, not an execution, an exorcism. Each thrust of the blade sought not just to kill the man, but to destroy the idea he represented, here in the bowels of power, in a secret passageway of his own palace. The living god, Gaius Julius Caesar, Germanicus, known by the nickname he despised, Caligula, met a very human end. He was 28 years old. He had ruled for less than 4 years, but in that brief span, Rome, mistress of the world, held its breath. The empire passed from hope to disbelief, and from disbelief to absolute terror. The question isn't who killed him. The real question, the one that chilled the blood of senators and guards alike, was why they took so long. If you're drawn to these hidden moments that shaped our world, consider subscribing and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing this community stretch across continents and centuries. To understand the magnitude of what happened in that tunnel on January 24th, 41 AD, you have to understand what Rome had become by the time Caligula seized power. This wasn't the Republic of Cicero and Caesar anymore. That old system had died in the civil wars, its corpse propped up by Augustus's genius for political theatre. The first emperor had performed the greatest magic trick in political history. He had created an autocracy while convincing everyone that the Republic still existed. For nearly 60 years, this illusion had held. Augustus ruled with a velvet glove or an iron fist, Tiberius with paranoid efficiency. But systems built on lies have a fatal flaw. They depend on the liar's skill. And when that throne passed to a 24-year-old who had spent his childhood in military camps, surrounded by soldiers who called him Little Boots, everything Augustus had carefully constructed began to unravel. The year was 37 AD, when Caligula first donned the purple. Rome stretched from Britain to the Euphrates, encompassing 50 million souls who looked to the Palatine Hill for their fate. The economy hummed with the wealth of conquest, tribute flowing in from 1,000 cities. Egyptian grain fed the capital's masses, Spanish silver filled the treasury, Gallic gold adorned the temples. The legions stood vigilant on distant frontiers, 28 legions totaling nearly 150,000 professional soldiers, backed by auxiliary forces that doubled that number. The capital itself had swollen to over 1 million inhabitants, a sprawling metropolis of marble temples and festering slums, of unimaginable luxury and grinding poverty existing side by side. In the wealthy districts, villas sprawled across manicured hills, their gardens perfumed with roses imported from Persia, their pools filled with fish from the Black Sea. Slaves numbering in the hundreds served single households, their lives worth less than the silverware they polished. But in the Subura and the Transtiben, in the narrow alleys where sunlight never penetrated, millions of Rome's poor lived in conditions that defied human dignity. Apartment buildings rose 7 and 8 stories high, their upper floors accessible only by ladders, their walls so thin that a neighbor's cough could wake an entire building. Fire was a constant threat. These insulae burned with terrifying regularity, consuming hundreds of lives in minutes. Into this world of extremes stepped a young man who had never known anything but absolute deference. Gaius had been born into the purple. Literally, his childhood had been spent in the imperial palace, surrounded by courtiers who hung on his every word, who treated his childish whims as if they were imperial decrees. He had grown up believing that the world existed for his pleasure, that other human beings were simply stage props in the drama of his life. He wasn't always a monster. At first, he was salvation itself. After the paranoid, gloomy reign of Tiberius, who had spent his final years on Capri, ruling through a network of spies and informers while bodies piled up in Rome, Caligula was a breath of fresh air. He was the son of the legendary general Germanicus, the man who had avenged the disaster at the Teutoburg forest and restored Roman honor in Germania. He was the grandson of the divine Augustus, the founder of the imperial system. The blood of gods flowed through his veins, and the people loved him for it. His first act seemed to herald a golden age that would surpass even Augustus's achievements. He abolished the treason trials that had terrorized the aristocracy under Tiberius, releasing political prisoners who had languished in dungeons for years. He recalled exiles from remote islands, reuniting families that had been torn apart by imperial paranoia. He distributed generous bonuses to the Praetorian Guard and the urban plebs, emptying the treasury in spectacular displays of generosity. The games he organized made Augustus's celebrations look modest by comparison. Gladiatorial contests stretched for days, with exotic animals imported from the farthest reaches of Africa, lions from Numidia, elephants from Ethiopia, crocodiles from the Nile's upper reaches. The chariot races became so elaborate that new tracks had to be constructed to accommodate the spectacle. Naval battles were staged in artificial lakes, complete with full-scale warships and crews of condemned criminals fighting to the death. The young emperor appeared to understand that power's greatest strength lay not in fear, but in love. He made himself accessible to the people in ways that Tiberius never had, appearing regularly in public, listening to petitions, showing interest in the concerns of ordinary Romans. He seemed to embody the promise of a new generation of leadership, young, energetic, connected to both the divine authority of his lineage and the human needs of his subjects. But there's something about absolute power that corrupts absolutely, as a future philosopher would write. It doesn't matter if you're good or evil when you ascend to power, the throne itself changes you. Day by day, decision by decision, it strips away your humanity until you become something else entirely. The process is so gradual that neither the ruler nor the ruled notice it happening until it's far too late. The transformation began with extravagance that seemed charming rather than alarming. Caligula spent money like water, depleting the treasury that Augustus had carefully filled through decades of efficient administration, but the spending seemed justified. Rome deserved magnificence, and who better to provide it than a god-born emperor? He built bridges across the Bay of Naples, just so he could ride across them wearing Alexander the Great's breastplate, which he had excavated from the conqueror's tomb in Alexandria. The engineering project was staggering, 3 miles of pontoon bridges supported by hundreds of ships, all so that one man could stage a theatrical reenactment of his hero's greatest victory. The cost was astronomical, but the spectacle was unforgettable. He staged elaborate gladiatorial contests where the death toll climbed into the hundreds, sometimes the thousands. But these weren't simple blood sports. They were carefully choreographed dramas with exotic costumes, elaborate sets, and storylines that stretched across multiple days. Audiences were transported to mythical worlds where gods battled monsters, where heroes faced impossible odds, where death and resurrection played out on the sand of the arena. He began construction projects on a scale that dwarfed all previous imperial ambitions. New aqueducts would bring fresh water from mountain springs hundreds of miles away. Harbors would be carved from solid rock to accommodate fleets of unprecedented size. Highways would stretch across marshes and mountains, connecting every corner of the empire to the capital. The vision was magnificent, the execution ruinously expensive. But absolute power is a poison that needs no time to act, and inside the mind of the young emperor, something was beginning to snap under the weight of unlimited authority. The official story was an illness, a terrible fever that struck in his 8th month of rule and nearly consumed him. For days he lay unconscious while the empire held its breath. Temples filled with worshippers begging the gods to spare their beloved emperor. Sacrifices were offered on a scale not seen since the founding of the city. Rome prayed as one organism, united in fear of losing the golden future that Caligula represented. The people genuinely loved him at this point. He was their young hero, their connection to the glorious past and the promising future. His death would have meant not just political chaos, but the collapse of their dreams for a better world. Their prayers were answered, the fever broke, and Caligula survived. But the man who rose from that sickbed was no longer the same. Something fundamental had shifted during those dark days of delirium. Whether it was brain damage from the fever, a psychological break triggered by the stress of absolute power, or simply the moment when his worst impulses finally overwhelmed his better nature, the transformation was complete and irreversible. He was a distorted version of his former self, a nightmare dressed in purple. The fever may have been real, but what it unleashed was something that had always lurked within the system Augustus created. For the first time in Roman history, a man sat on the throne who genuinely believed that the title Imperator meant what it literally claimed, that he was a god walking among mortals, bound by no law except his own will. The first symptom was an insatiable thirst, not for water, but for blood. He reopened the treason trials with a vengeance that made Tiberius's persecutions look restrained. But this time, they were a macabre theatre, where justice was replaced by whim, where guilt was predetermined, and innocence was irrelevant. Accusations were absurd by any rational standard. Men were condemned for failing to swear by his genius with sufficient enthusiasm. Others were executed for neglecting to sacrifice to his divine image before conducting business. Some were killed for appearing in his dreams, in a disrespectful manner. The definition of treason expanded to include any action, word, or even thought that displeased the emperor. Marcus Junius Silanus, a respected senator and former consul, was accused of treason for expressing mild criticism of the emperor's spending policies. His trial lasted less than an hour. His execution was carried out immediately afterward, and his property was confiscated before his body was cold. His family was forbidden to mourn him publicly, and his name was ordered erased from all public records. Gaius Scribonius Curio, whose family had served Rome for generations, was executed for the crime of owning a house that Caligula wanted for one of his building projects. When Curio refused to sell at the price the emperor offered, he was charged with treason for obstructing imperial will. His execution was public, his family was exiled, and his house was demolished rather than occupied. The emperor had simply wanted to destroy it for his own amusement. But the financial motivation behind many of these executions was nakedly obvious. Caligula's spectacular spending had drained the treasury, and confiscated estates provided a quick way to refill it. The wealthy discovered that their riches made them targets rather than protectors. Inheritance became a crime. If Caligula decided he deserved the money more than the rightful heirs, he would attend funerals and declare himself moved by grief, then confiscate the deceased's entire estate as tribute to their memory. At the funeral of Gnaeus Lentulus Getulicus, a wealthy senator who had died of natural causes, Caligula wept publicly for the loss of such a noble Roman. Then he announced that the best way to honor Getulicus's memory was to ensure that his wealth served the divine emperor, who would use it more wisely than any mortal heir could. But it wasn't just about money. Caligula seemed to derive genuine pleasure from humiliation, from the psychological destruction of the most powerful people in the world. This wasn't the calculated cruelty of a rational tyrant. It was the sadistic joy of a predator toying with its prey. He forced senators to run for miles beside his litter during the summer heat, their purple-striped togas streaming behind them as they gasped for breath and stumbled on the cobblestones. These weren't young men. Many were in their 60s and 70s, their bodies worn down by years of comfortable urban living, but age and dignity meant nothing to an emperor who measured his power by his ability to humiliate. Senator Pomponius Secundus, a man who had commanded legions in Germania and Britain, was forced to act as Caligula's personal herald. He had to stand in the forum and announce the emperor's divine pronouncements to crowds of citizens who remembered when Secundus had been one of Rome's most respected leaders. The irony was deliberate. The man who had once commanded armies was now reduced to being a messenger boy for a tyrant half his age. Marcus Lepidus, who was married to Caligula's sister Drusilla, had to publicly thank the emperor for the privilege of sharing his wife with him. At state banquets, Lepidus would stand before the assembled guests and express his gratitude that the divine emperor had chosen to honor his marriage bed with his presence. The humiliation was calculated to destroy not just Lepidus, but the entire concept of aristocratic dignity. These humiliations were carefully orchestrated psychological warfare, designed not just to punish individuals, but to teach the entire ruling class their new place in the world. Every senator who watched a colleague's degradation understood that his turn might come next. Every knight who witnessed an aristocrat's humiliation knew that wealth and status offered no protection against imperial whim. The city that had once prided itself on the dignity of its institutions, the gravity of its ceremonies, the respect accorded to age and achievement, now watched its most honored citizens reduced to the status of performing animals. The psychological damage went beyond individual trauma. It shattered the collective sense of what Roman civilization represented. Fear became the air that Rome breathed, thick, paralyzing fear that seeped into every corner of society like a poisonous fog. No one was safe, regardless of their station, their connections, or their past service to the state. Senators checked their words before speaking, even in private conversations with their closest friends. The walls themselves seemed to have ears, and careless words had a way of reaching the emperor's attention. Slaves reported on their masters, offering information in exchange for freedom or simply to avoid punishment for their owners' crimes. Children informed on their parents when imperial agents promised rewards for loyalty to the emperor above family. The bonds that held society together, trust between friends, loyalty within families, respect between social classes, began to dissolve under the corrosive influence of universal suspicion. In the streets, ordinary citizens whispered that the emperor had been possessed by demons, that the gods had abandoned Rome, that the end times prophesied by the Sibylline books had finally arrived. Astrologers read omens of doom in every celestial event. Eclipses became harbingers of imperial wrath. Unusual cloud formations were interpreted as divine warnings. The flights of birds were scrutinized for clues about which senator would be executed next. The Sibylline books, the ancient prophetic texts that had guided Rome through previous crises, were consulted so frequently that their pages began to wear thin from handling. But the prophecies they contained offered no comfort, only warnings of greater disasters to come, of a ruler who would bring Rome to the edge of destruction through his hubris and madness. Religious observance, which had always been a public duty rather than a private devotion, took on desperate urgency. Citizens made offerings not just to ensure good fortune, but to ward off the emperor's attention. Temples were crowded with worshippers begging the gods to make them invisible to imperial notice. Prayer became a survival strategy rather than a spiritual practice. But terror wasn't enough for Caligula. As his power became more absolute, his appetites grew more extravagant. He craved something more than fear. He demanded worship. It wasn't sufficient to be emperor, to hold the power of life and death over 50 million people. He declared himself a living god, the equal of Jupiter himself, worthy of the same reverence that Romans had offered to the immortals for centuries. This wasn't mere megalomania, though it certainly contained elements of grandiose delusion. It was a logical extension of the imperial system Augustus had created, taken to its ultimate conclusion. If the emperor's word was law, if his decisions controlled the fate of the known world, if his image appeared on coins alongside the traditional gods, what really separated him from divinity except convention and restraint? Augustus had been careful to maintain the fiction that he was merely the first citizen among equals, that his power derived from the people's consent rather than divine appointment. Tiberius had been content to wield godlike power while maintaining the pretense of mortality. But Caligula, with the brutal honesty of madness, simply took the logic to its conclusion and declared what had always been implicit, that the emperor was in fact a god. He ordered the heads torn from statues of the most venerated deities throughout the empire and replaced them with his own. In temples across the Mediterranean world, Jupiter, Mars, Apollo, and Minerva suddenly bore the face of a 26-year-old man with thinning hair and a cruel smile. The priesthood, which had served these gods for centuries, now found themselves worshipping a mortal who demanded the same reverence once reserved for immortals. The psychological impact on the empire's population was staggering. These weren't just political changes, they were attacks on the fundamental structure of reality as Romans understood it. The gods had been constants in their world, sources of comfort and continuity that transcended the rise and fall of individual rulers. To see those divine faces replaced with the emperor's features was to watch the collapse of the sacred order that had sustained Roman civilization for 8 centuries. In Alexandria, riots broke out when local officials attempted to replace the head of a statue of Serapis with Caligula's image. The Egyptian population, which had maintained their religious traditions through centuries of foreign rule, saw this as a desecration too profound to tolerate. Roman troops had to be called in to suppress the unrest, and hundreds died defending temples that had stood since the time of the Ptolemies. In Athens, the ancient center of philosophical learning, scholars who had spent their lives contemplating the nature of divinity found themselves required to offer prayers to a living man who embodied everything their teachings said. A god should not be capricious, cruel, driven by base human appetites rather than divine wisdom. Some complied out of fear, others fled the city, and a few chose suicide rather than participate in what they saw as cosmic blasphemy. But perhaps Caligula's most ambitious project was his attempt to relocate the statue of Jupiter Olympius, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, from Greece to his palace in Rome. The statue, created by the legendary sculptor Phidias, stood 40 feet tall and was considered the most perfect representation of divine majesty ever created. To move it would require engineering on a scale that challenged the limits of Roman technology. Caligula commanded his engineers to design ships capable of carrying the Colossus, roads strong enough to bear its weight, and lifting devices that could raise it without damage. The cost was staggering. Entire provinces were taxed to fund the project, but the emperor was determined to have the greatest artistic representation of godhood standing in his own residence, where he could commune with it as an equal. The omens surrounding this project were universally terrible. According to multiple witnesses, when workers first attempted to move the statue, it let out such thunderous laughter that the scaffolding collapsed, killing dozens of workers. Birds fell dead from the sky around the temple. The earth trembled, and a voice, some said it was Jupiter himself, spoke from the statue, warning that mortals who attempted to move the king of gods would face divine retribution. But Caligula dismissed these signs as superstitious nonsense. He accused the priests of staging the phenomena to protect their temple's most valuable treasure. He ordered the work to continue, threatening to execute any engineer or worker who claimed the gods were opposing the project. His determination to possess the statue became a test of wills between himself and the traditional gods, a contest he was confident he would win. In Rome itself, he constructed an elaborate temple dedicated to his own worship, complete with a full priesthood and daily sacrifices. The building rivaled the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus in size and grandeur, its marble walls adorned with gold and precious stones looted from temples throughout the empire. Citizens were required to offer prayers to his divine image before conducting any business, public or private. The temple's daily operations were a parody of traditional Roman religion, elevated to the level of state doctrine. Instead of asking the gods for good harvests or military victory, worshippers prayed to Caligula for protection from Caligula's own wrath. The emperor's statue, which stood in the temple's central chamber, was dressed in different costumes depending on his mood, sometimes as Jupiter with thunderbolts, sometimes as Mars in military regalia, sometimes as Apollo with a golden lyre. But perhaps most tellingly, he built a bridge connecting his palace to the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, declaring that the gods were now his neighbors and equals. The bridge was a marvel of engineering, spanning the valley between the Palatine and Capitoline Hills with a single arch that seemed to defy gravity. But its symbolic significance was even more impressive than its construction. Caligula would often be seen walking across this bridge at dawn, dressed in divine regalia that changed according to which god he was impersonating that day. Sometimes he wore Jupiter's costume, complete with artificial thunderbolts that he would hurl at citizens below. Other times he appeared as Neptune, carrying a trident and wearing a crown of seashells. He treated these appearances as official state functions, requiring senators and foreign ambassadors to attend and offer worship. The bridge became the stage for increasingly elaborate divine performances. Caligula would engage in conversations with invisible gods, shouting questions and pausing to listen to replies that only he could hear. He would issue decrees in the names of various deities, claiming to serve as their earthly messenger. Citizens gathered below to watch these spectacles, uncertain whether they were witnessing religious ceremonies or the ravings of a madman. The psychological effect on Rome was devastating beyond anything previous emperors had achieved. The city that had conquered the world through practical politics and military efficiency now found itself ruled by a man who had declared himself a deity and seemed to genuinely believe in his own divinity. Soldiers who had marched across continents in the name of Roman values now swore allegiance to a god-emperor who seemed to change the laws of reality on a whim. The empire's administrative structure, which had functioned efficiently for decades under Augustus and Tiberius, began to break down under the strain of Caligula's divine pretensions. Governors in distant provinces received contradictory orders, supposedly issued by different gods speaking through the emperor. Tax collectors were told to gather tribute for temples dedicated to imperial worship, while military commanders were instructed to lead their troops in prayers to Caligula before engaging in battle. Foreign relations became impossible to conduct rationally when the emperor insisted on being addressed as a god by visiting ambassadors. Diplomatic protocols that had developed over centuries were abandoned in favor of religious ceremonies that left foreign representatives confused about whether they were attending political meetings or worship services. Some kingdoms began questioning whether Rome could still be trusted as a reliable partner when its ruler appeared to have lost touch with reality. In the midst of this megalomaniacal madness, at the heart of the guard meant to protect him, a man clenched his teeth each day, enduring a personal humiliation that would soon become the catalyst for rebellion. His name was Cassius Chaerea, a tribune of the Praetorian Guard, and Caligula had made the fatal error of making him the center of his mockery. Cassius Chaerea was no young idealist, drunk on republican principles or philosophical theories about the proper limits of government power. He was a professional soldier, 48 years old, with scars from a dozen campaigns etched into his weathered face. He had served under Germanicus, Caligula's own father, during the brutal Germanic Wars, where Roman legions had pushed deep into the forests beyond the Rhine to avenge the massacre at the Teutoburg forest. He had fought in the marshes of northern Germany, where entire armies could disappear into the fog and mud. He had faced Germanic berserkers who fought naked in winter snow, their bodies painted with blue dye, their minds lost in battle madness, induced by sacred mushrooms. He had survived ambushes in dense forests where every tree could hide an enemy archer, where the very landscape seemed hostile to Roman civilization. He had suppressed mutinies with his own sword, facing down legionaries who had been driven to rebellion by impossible conditions and incompetent leadership. In the year 14, when Augustus died and the legions began to question whether Tiberius deserved their loyalty, Chaerea had stood before thousands of angry soldiers and convinced them to maintain their oaths through the force of his own reputation and the respect they bore for his courage. He had seen men die in every conceivable way, cut down by enemy swords, trampled by cavalry charges, drowned in river crossings, frozen to death in winter campaigns, where the cold was more dangerous than any human enemy. He had killed men himself, not in anger or hatred, but with the calm professionalism of a soldier doing his duty. Courage ran through his veins like blood, earned through years of combat on Rome's most dangerous frontiers. His service record was impeccable, his loyalty to Rome unquestioned, his competence recognized by every commander he had served under. He had been promoted through the ranks based on merit rather than connections, rising from common legionary to tribune through demonstrated ability in the field. His fellow soldiers respected him not because of his family name or his political connections, but because he had proven himself worthy of their trust in situations where failure meant death. But when the god emperor looked at Chaerea, he saw none of this. He saw no warrior, no veteran, no man who had spent his life in service to Rome. He saw weakness, an opportunity for entertainment, a target for the kind of sadistic humor that had become Caligula's trademark. Chaerea had one unfortunate physical trait that made him vulnerable to imperial mockery, a voice that was surprisingly high-pitched for a man of his stature and reputation. It was a minor peculiarity, the kind of thing that might provoke gentle teasing among friends or brothers in arms, but nothing more serious. In the masculine culture of the Roman military, where a deep voice was associated with authority and command presence, Chaerea's high voice was a source of mild embarrassment, but no real impediment to his career. His actions had always spoken louder than his voice, and his reputation was built on deeds rather than oratory. But Caligula found this trait infinitely amusing, a source of endless entertainment in a court where the emperor's slightest amusement could mean the difference between life and death for those around him. In a world where the emperor's approval or disapproval could elevate a man to unimaginable heights or cast him into the deepest dungeons, becoming the object of imperial humor was a dangerous position indeed. Every day the humiliation was a ritual as regular and predictable as sunrise. As tribune of the guard, Chaerea had to ask the emperor for the daily password, a standard military procedure that ensured the security of the palace and coordinated the activities of the various guard units. For generations, these passwords had been simple, practical words chosen for their clarity and ease of transmission. Victory, Rome, Augustus, honor. The exchange was typically brief and businesslike, a routine piece of military administration that took only seconds to complete. Under Caligula, this mundane interaction became his personal theatre, a daily opportunity to demonstrate his power over one of Rome's most respected soldiers. The emperor would make Chaerea wait, sometimes for hours, while he attended to other matters, or simply sat in silence, savouring the anticipation. When he finally granted the tribune an audience, he would draw out the moment like a master dramatist building toward a climax. "What's today's password, my brave Chaerea?" The emperor would pause, savouring the moment like fine wine, watching the veteran's face for any sign of reaction. "Today it shall be Priapus, sometimes Venus," always names of gods associated with love, lust, feminine sexuality, or, in Priapus's case, crude masculine sexuality that mocked the very concept of military dignity. The choice of these particular divine names was calculated cruelty. Priapus was the god of fertility and male sexual prowess, but he was also a figure of ridicule in Roman culture, depicted with grotesquely oversized genitalia and regarded as a comic rather than majestic deity. To force a veteran warrior to repeat this name was to associate him with something both sexual and ridiculous, undermining his masculine dignity in the most fundamental way possible. Venus, the goddess of love and beauty, was perhaps even more insulting in this context. By choosing her name as a military password, Caligula was feminizing the entire concept of military security, suggesting that Rome's defenses were as soft and yielding as a woman's embrace. For a soldier like Chaerea, who had built his identity around the traditionally masculine virtues of courage, strength, and military prowess, this daily reminder of feminine weakness was like a dagger thrust to the heart of his self-conception. The other guards present during these exchanges would lower their eyes, some stifling nervous laughter that threatened to escape despite their best efforts at self-control. They weren't laughing from any genuine appreciation of the emperor's humor. Most of them respected Chaerea and were uncomfortable witnessing his humiliation, but in Caligula's court, failing to appreciate the emperor's jokes was as dangerous as open rebellion. Laughter had become a survival mechanism, a way of demonstrating loyalty to an unpredictable ruler whose favor could shift without warning. To laugh was an order, and disobedience to any imperial command, however trivial or cruel, was treason punishable by death. The guards had seen what happened to those who failed to show sufficient enthusiasm for the emperor's entertainment. Senator Marcus Calidius had been executed for failing to laugh loudly enough at one of Caligula's jokes. Praetorian Gaius Protogenes had been demoted and flogged for allowing his face to show disapproval during one of the emperor's theatrical performances. And Chaerea, the hardened soldier who had faced Germanic berserkers and British charioteers without flinching, had to stand there and take it. He had to accept the mockery with apparent good humor, thank his god emperor for the honor of serving him, and march away while laughter stabbed at his back like invisible knives. The irony was not lost on him. He, who had never retreated from a battle, found himself retreating daily from a pale young man who had never held a sword in anger. The humiliation cut deeper than physical pain, because it attacked the core of who Chaerea believed himself to be. He was a Roman soldier, heir to a tradition of military excellence that stretched back to the legendary heroes who had built the empire. He had earned his position through demonstrated courage and competence, not through family connections or political maneuvering. His identity was built on the respect of his peers and the knowledge that he had served Rome faithfully in its hour of need. But each day's ritual stripped away another layer of that dignity, replacing it with shame and rage that had no outlet. In the military culture that had shaped him, a man's honor was his most precious possession, more valuable than wealth or position, or even life itself. To lose one's honor was to become less than human, to forfeit one's place in the community of warriors that gave meaning to existence. Yet he was trapped by his own loyalty to the institution he served. To strike back at Caligula would be to betray his oath to the Praetorian Guard, to abandon his duty to Rome itself. The emperor might be mad, cruel, and unworthy of respect, but he was still the legitimate ruler of the empire, the man to whom Chaerea had sworn absolute obedience. The soldier's training that had sustained him through decades of service now became a prison that prevented him from defending his own dignity. But each insult was a drop of fuel on a fire that burned deeper with every passing day. The rage that he couldn't express in the emperor's presence followed him home to his modest quarters, where he lay awake at night, replaying the day's humiliation, and imagining the satisfaction of driving a sword between Caligula's ribs. The fantasies became more elaborate with each repetition, not just killing the tyrant, but making him suffer first, making him understand what it felt like to be powerless and humiliated. The emperor's madness was no longer a secret to anyone in Rome. It was a public spectacle performed on the grandest stage in the world. Foreign ambassadors returned to their kingdoms with tales that sounded like myths or fever dreams. The Roman emperor, who declared himself a god and spoke to statues as if they were old friends, who named his horse as consul and seriously considered making it a full partner in government, who built temples to his own worship and demanded that the entire empire treat him as a deity. Merchants carried these stories along the trade routes that connected Rome to the far corners of the known world. In the markets of Alexandria, Damascus, and Antioch, traders who had witnessed Caligula's divine performances described them to disbelieving audiences who wondered if Roman power was finally beginning to crack under the weight of its own absurdity. The horse incitatus became perhaps the most visible symbol of how far Rome had fallen from its founding ideals. Caligula didn't just love the animal, he treated it as a fellow aristocrat, a peer whose company he preferred to that of the senators and knights, who had traditionally served as the emperor's counselors and companions. The horse lived in a marble stable that was more luxurious than most Roman homes, with an ivory manger carved by the finest artisans and purple blankets, woven from silk imported from distant China. Incitatus wore jeweled collars worth more than most senators' annual income, necklaces of pearls and gold that sparkled in the sunlight as the animal was paraded through the streets of Rome. Slaves attended to its every need, as if it were a member of the imperial family, grooming its coat with perfumed oils, feeding it oats mixed with gold flakes, even tasting its food to ensure that no one had attempted to poison the emperor's beloved companion. But the consulship was the ultimate insult to every tradition that had made Rome great. The office that had once been held by Cicero and Cato, by the greatest orators and statesmen in Roman history, was now shared with a racehorse that couldn't even understand the concept of governance. Senators who traced their lineages back to the founding of the Republic found themselves outranked by an animal that spent its days eating, sleeping, and occasionally racing around a track for the entertainment of the masses. The appointment wasn't just evidence of madness, it was calculated cruelty, designed to demonstrate the emperor's absolute power over the institutions that had previously defined Roman civilization. Caligula was telling the Senate, in the clearest possible terms, that their most sacred office was worth less than his favorite pet. Their debates, their ancient privileges, their carefully maintained dignity, all of it meant nothing to a man who could elevate a horse above them with a casual word. The ceremony installing Incitatus as consul was conducted with all the traditional solemnity that had attended such occasions for centuries. The horse was dressed in a toga and led into the Senate house, where it stood silently while priests offered the customary prayers for divine guidance. Senators who had spent their lives mastering the arts of rhetoric and statecraft now found themselves expected to treat an animal as their equal in the governance of the empire. Some laughed, either from genuine amusement or from the nervous relief of people who couldn't quite believe what they were witnessing. Others wept, not just for their own humiliation, but for the death of everything they had believed about Roman greatness. A few tried to treat the ceremony seriously, addressing formal questions to the horse and pretending to listen for responses that would never come. But most simply endured in silence, their faces carefully composed to show neither approval nor disapproval, their minds focused on survival rather than the larger implications of what they were witnessing. They had learned that in Caligula's Rome, the appearance of acceptance was more important than genuine consent, and that visible resistance to even the most absurd imperial commands could mean death. The installation of Incitatus marked a turning point in the relationship between emperor and senate. What had begun as political subordination under Augustus had evolved into systematic humiliation under Caligula. The senators were no longer partners in governance, even junior partners. They were props in an elaborate performance designed to demonstrate the emperor's omnipotence over every aspect of Roman life. His orgies became legendary throughout the Mediterranean world, not just for their scale and excess, but for their calculated cruelty. These weren't simple celebrations of physical pleasure or even displays of imperial wealth. They were elaborate psychological tortures, designed to break the spirits of Rome's most powerful families. Every aspect was carefully planned to maximize humiliation while maintaining the pretense of hospitality. The banquets would begin normally enough, with traditional foods and entertainment that recalled the dignified symposiums of the Republic, but as the evening progressed, they would transform into something altogether darker. Caligula would signal for the real entertainment to begin with a gesture or a word, and the carefully controlled atmosphere would explode into chaos that seemed spontaneous but was actually choreographed down to the smallest detail. He would openly sleep with the wives of senators and knights, often during the very banquets where their husbands sat as guests. The emperor would rise from his couch, approach a woman who had caught his fancy, and simply announce his intentions to the assembled company. There was no pretense of seduction or consent. The emperor's desire was equivalent to divine command, and resistance was unthinkable. The husbands could only watch as their wives were led away to private chambers, their faces frozen in expressions that revealed nothing of the rage and humiliation burning inside them. To object would be treason. To show distress would be interpreted as criticism of the emperor's divine prerogatives. They had to sit and continue eating, making conversation with other guests as if nothing extraordinary was happening. Upon returning to the dining room hours later, Caligula would describe in explicit detail the intimate qualities of these women, rating their performance and comparing them to previous conquests, all while their husbands sat frozen in humiliated silence. He would critique their techniques, discuss their physical attributes, and offer suggestions for improvement, as if he were reviewing gladiatorial performances rather than describing the violation of other men's wives. The senator Gaius Piso endured perhaps the most elaborate of these humiliations during his own wedding feast. Caligula had attended the ceremony as an honored guest, offering the traditional blessings and participating in the religious rituals that sanctified the marriage. But as the celebration reached its peak, the emperor announced that he wished to offer the bride a special imperial blessing in private. Piso, who had commanded legions in Germania and governed provinces with distinction, could only watch helplessly as Caligula led his new wife away from their wedding feast. The other guests continued the celebration, but the atmosphere had become surreal. They were toasting a marriage that was being destroyed before their eyes by the very man who had blessed it hours earlier. When the emperor returned, he announced to the assembled guests that the bride was adequate, though she lacks the enthusiasm of her sister, whom I enjoyed last month. The casual cruelty of the statement was breathtaking. Not only had he violated Piso's wife, but he revealed that he had previously done the same to her sister, turning what should have been a joyous family celebration into a catalogue of imperial predations. Piso sat through the remainder of his wedding feast, with a smile frozen on his face, accepting congratulations from guests who were as trapped as he was in this elaborate charade. His marriage had been destroyed before it could properly begin, but he had to pretend gratitude for the emperor's attention to his family. The psychological damage went far beyond personal humiliation. It demonstrated that no relationship, no matter how sacred, was beyond the emperor's reach. But even this wasn't the depth of Caligula's depravity. He violated his own sisters, Agrippina, Drusilla, and Livilla, treating them as his personal property rather than as family members. These weren't secret indiscretions hidden from public view, but open relationships that he flaunted as evidence of his divine nature. When the Roman people murmured about these relationships, he declared that gods could not be bound by mortal laws of kinship. The precedent he cited was Jupiter's relationship with his sister Juno, conveniently ignoring the fact that mythological gods were not supposed to serve as literal models for human behavior. He commissioned artists to create sculptures depicting himself in intimate embraces with his sisters, displaying them in public spaces where citizens could contemplate the emperor's divine sexuality. Poets were ordered to compose verses celebrating these relationships as examples of divine love that transcended mortal understanding. Drusilla became his particular favorite, elevated, above his other sisters, to the status of semi-divine consort. He showered her with honors and titles traditionally reserved for the emperor's wife, building temples in her honor and requiring citizens to swear oaths by her divine spirit. She accompanied him to state functions, sat beside him during Senate meetings, and was treated as a full partner in the governance of the empire. When Drusilla died, whether by natural illness, suicide, or by Caligula's own hand remains a matter of historical debate. The emperor's grief took on horrifying dimensions that revealed the depths of his psychological disintegration. He didn't just mourn her death, he declared it a cosmic tragedy that required the entire empire to share in his suffering. He deified her immediately, establishing a cult with priests and temples that rivaled the worship of traditional gods. But he also declared a period of mourning so absolute that anyone who laughed, bathed or dined with their family during this time was guilty of treason punishable by death. The normal activities of daily life became capital crimes if they suggested that citizens were not sufficiently devastated by the divine Drusilla's passing. For months, Rome lived under a pall of enforced sorrow that turned the city into a necropolis of the living. Children were forbidden to play in the streets. Their laughter was interpreted as disrespect for the dead goddess. Markets operated in whispers, with merchants afraid to show any sign of commercial enthusiasm. Bathhouses closed because bathing was considered a pleasure inappropriate during the mourning period. Even private celebrations were banned as disrespectful to Drusilla's memory. Weddings were postponed indefinitely, birthdays went unacknowledged, and religious festivals dedicated to other gods were cancelled so that nothing could compete with the cult of the dead empress. The empire's entire cultural life was subordinated to one man's twisted grief. Citizens who were caught smiling faced interrogation by imperial agents who demanded explanations for their inappropriate cheerfulness. Families reported each other to the authorities for showing insufficient signs of mourning. Children learned to cry on command when strangers approached, afraid that their natural resilience might be interpreted as treason. The economic impact was staggering as normal commercial activity ground to a halt. Merchants couldn't advertise their wares with enthusiasm, craftsmen couldn't take pride in their work, and farmers couldn't celebrate successful harvests. The empire that had thrived on trade and commerce found itself paralyzed by an emperor's demand that 50 million people share in his personal anguish. Rome didn't have an emperor anymore. It had a predator loose in the halls of power, a creature that wore human form, but operated by the logic of a malevolent god who demanded not just obedience but emotional submission from his subjects. The psychological toll on the city was immense and measurable. Suicide rates among the upper classes skyrocketed as families chose death over the daily humiliation of Caligula's rule. The methods varied. Some chose the traditional Roman route of opening their veins in warm baths, others took poison, and a few simply stopped eating until starvation claimed them. Philosophers who had once debated the nature of justice and virtue now wrote treatises on the most painless methods of self-destruction. The Stoic school, which taught acceptance of fate and the cultivation of inner tranquility regardless of external circumstances, found itself overwhelmed with students seeking ways to endure the unendurable. But even Stoic philosophy proved inadequate when confronted with the systematic destruction of human dignity that Caligula had perfected. Marcus Seneca, the philosopher and playwright, who would later tutor Nero, wrote during this period that the emperor has discovered how to make death seem like mercy and life like the cruelest punishment. His letters describe a city where hope had become a form of madness, where rational people planned their suicides as carefully as others planned their careers. The great libraries of Rome, which had been centers of learning and intellectual discourse for generations, fell into disuse as scholars fled the city or abandoned their studies. The emperor had made it clear that he found intellectuals particularly amusing targets for his cruelty, and few were willing to risk attracting his attention through visible displays of learning or philosophical inquiry. Medical texts from the period describe a new category of illness, what physicians called imperial fever, a condition characterized by chronic anxiety, sleeplessness, and a wasting away of the body that seemed to have no physical cause. The symptoms matched what modern medicine would recognize as severe depression and post-traumatic stress, but Roman doctors could only observe and document the epidemic of despair that was consuming their patients. Charia's personal humiliation found echo in this collective nightmare. He began to speak, carefully, quietly, to seek out ears that might be willing to listen to dangerous thoughts. It wasn't difficult to find them. The conspiracy that would eventually end Caligula's life didn't spring from ideology or patriotic fervor, but from simple, desperate self-preservation. The conversations began in the most mundane settings, brief exchanges during guard rotations, whispered words in the corridors of the Palatine, careful glances that communicated more than spoken language ever could. Cheria didn't set out to become a revolutionary. He simply started talking to other men who shared his desperation and his growing conviction that Caligula's rule could not continue. Cornelius Sabinus, his fellow tribune, was among the first to respond to these cautious overtures. Sabinus was sick of being the executioner's arm for a lunatic who might order him to kill his own family tomorrow. The Praetorian Guard, which had once been the elite of the elite, now found itself reduced to the role of enablers for increasingly bizarre atrocities. The guards had witnessed things that no Roman soldier should have to see. They had watched their emperor torture senators for entertainment, had been forced to participate in mock religious ceremonies that blasphemed against the gods of their fathers, had been ordered to arrest and execute men whose only crime was failing to appreciate the emperor's sense of humor. But more than the moral revulsion, more than the professional shame, was the growing realization that none of them were safe. Caligula's favor was as unpredictable as his wrath, and today's trusted guard could become tomorrow's victim on the basis of a dream, a perceived slight or simple imperial whim. They had seen too many of their comrades disappear without explanation to believe that their current positions offered any real security. The real key conspirators, however, came from the Senate, men like Aeneas Vinicius, who possessed both the political connections and the desperate motivation needed to organize resistance. These weren't idealistic republicans dreaming of restoring the old constitution or returning to the golden age of Cicero and Cato. They were terrified aristocrats who had done the mathematical calculation and realized that, at Caligula's current rate of execution and confiscation, none of them would survive another year. Vinicius had watched his fortune dwindle as the emperor confiscated properties on invented pretexts. He had seen his friends and relatives disappear into the imperial dungeons for crimes that consisted of nothing more than possessing wealth that Caligula coveted. His own name had appeared on lists of suspected traitors that circulated through the palace, and he knew that his execution was not a matter of if, but when. "Each dawn is a gamble," they whispered in darkened corridors and abandoned temples, in the private chambers of houses that had belonged to their families for generations. "We don't know which of us won't see nightfall. This cannot continue. It's him or us." The planning began in the shadows of the very system they were trying to destroy. They met in private homes where they had once entertained emperors, in temple alcoves where they had prayed for imperial victories, in the forgotten corners of the Palatine complex itself, where they had served as advisors and administrators. The conspiracy had no grand ideology, no vision of a restored republic. It was driven by the simple animal need to survive. They were careful to keep their meetings small and their conversations vague. Too many conspirators meant too many chances for betrayal, and Caligula's network of informers had made paranoia a survival skill. They spoke in metaphors and allusions, discussing agricultural problems when they meant political assassination, referring to pest control when they planned regicide. But they needed more than courage, and more than numbers. They needed an opportunity, a moment when the god emperor would be vulnerable to mortal weapons wielded by mortal hands, and that seemed almost impossible, given the elaborate security apparatus that surrounded him. Caligula lived in a fortress of paranoia that would have impressed Tiberius himself. His personal Germanic guard, massive barbarians, loyal only to gold and to the man who provided it in abundance, formed an impenetrable wall of muscle and steel around him. These men didn't understand Roman politics or republican principles, didn't care about senatorial dignity or constitutional traditions. They understood only combat and payment, which made them perfect protectors for a tyrant who trusted no one with Roman blood in their veins. They were chosen specifically for their foreignness, recruited from tribes beyond the Rhine, who had no connection to Roman society or culture. Unlike Roman soldiers, who might have divided loyalties between emperor and homeland, between personal oath and institutional duty, these Germans had no connection to Roman tradition or law. Caligula was their entire world, their commander, their paymaster, their reason for existing in the heart of the empire that had conquered their people. Each of these guards stood over 6 feet tall, with the kind of massive build that came from a lifetime of warfare in the forests and marshes of Germania. They wore their blonde hair long in the style of their tribes, braided with rings of gold that marked their status as elite warriors. Their weapons were not the standardized equipment of Roman legionaries, but the personal arms of barbarian champions, long swords with intricate patterns welded into the steel, round shields painted with tribal symbols, spears tipped with iron points that could punch through Roman mail. To kill Caligula, the conspirators would have to get through them, and that was a suicide mission by any reasonable calculation. These men had been trained from childhood to fight and die for their war leaders, and they regarded protecting the emperor as the sacred duty that justified their existence in a foreign land. They would not hesitate, would not negotiate, would not be bought or intimidated. They would fight until every last one of them was dead. Moreover, they never left him alone. They slept outside his chambers in shifts that ensured constant vigilance, stood guard during his meals with hands always on their weapon hilts, and accompanied him to the baths, where they watched from the shadows while he soaked in water that they had personally tested for poison. They were present during his most private moments, witnessing his conversations with imaginary gods, his midnight rambles through the palace, his increasingly erratic behavior. The Germanic guards had developed their own protocols for dealing with their master's madness. They had learned to ignore his conversations with statues, to treat his divine proclamations as normal human speech, to respond to his orders regardless of how bizarre they might seem. When he commanded them to arrest the god Neptune, they would gravely search the palace pools. When he declared war on the sea itself, they would march to the beach and collect seashells as prisoners of war. Their literal interpretation of impossible orders had become a form of protection for everyone involved. By treating Caligula's delusions as if they were rational commands, the guards avoided having to confront the question of their master's sanity, while providing him with the response he needed to maintain his grip on reality. Moreover, Caligula's paranoia had taught him to vary his routines in ways that made planning an attack almost impossible. He rarely ate at the same time twice, never took the same path through the palace on consecutive days, and often changed his mind about appointments at the last moment. The man who seemed so mad in public was coldly rational when it came to preserving his own life. He had studied the assassinations of previous rulers, learning from Caesar's fate in the theatre of Pompey and from the various plots that had been uncovered during Augustus's reign. He understood that predictability was vulnerability, that routine was the assassin's greatest ally, so he made himself unpredictable, changing his schedule hourly, cancelling planned appearances, arriving early or late to confound anyone who might be watching and waiting. His food was prepared by a constantly rotating staff of cooks and tasters, none of whom knew what they would be preparing until the moment they began working. His wine came from different vineyards each day, selected at random from the imperial cellars. His clothes were chosen by servants, who were themselves chosen randomly each morning from a pool of hundreds. The conspirators knew they had to choose their moment with surgical precision. A single error, a moment's hesitation, and not only would they fail, their deaths would become the next day's entertainment for the man they had tried to kill. Caligula had developed a taste for creative executions that served both as punishment for the condemned and entertainment for himself. Previous failed assassins had been kept alive for days, while the emperor experimented with different forms of torture. Some were fed to wild animals in private arenas, others were crucified in the palace gardens, where the emperor could watch their suffering from his dining room windows. The lucky ones were simply beheaded, but Caligula rarely chose the merciful option when more elaborate alternatives were available. Time was running out with each passing day. Every morning brought new atrocities, new executions, new reasons for Caligula to suspect that someone, somewhere, was plotting against him. The longer they waited, the more likely it became that their conspiracy would be discovered through informers, careless words, or simple bad luck, and discovery meant not just death, but the kind of prolonged creative torture that Caligula had perfected as an art form. The emperor's paranoia was growing more acute as well, fed by genuine threats and imaginary enemies alike. He had begun to suspect everyone around him, from his closest advisors to the slaves who cleaned his chambers. His speeches to the Senate had become rambling accusations against unnamed conspirators who were supposedly plotting against his divine person. He had started conducting loyalty tests, asking unexpected questions designed to trap potential traitors in contradictory answers. The opportunity they needed would have to come soon, or it would never come at all. They needed a moment when Caligula would be separated from his Germanic guards, when his routines would override his paranoia, when the god emperor would be forced to act like a mortal man subject to mortal vulnerabilities. The Ludi Palatini arrived like a gift from the gods themselves, wrapped in the festivals and rituals that defined Roman cultural life. The Ludi Palatini were games held in honor of the divine Augustus, the founder of the imperial system, and the man who had first successfully bridged the gap between republican tradition and autocratic reality. They were among the most prestigious festivals in the Roman calendar, a multi-day celebration of theatre, music, chariot races, and gladiatorial contests that took place right in the heart of the empire's power, on the Palatine Hill itself, within the very walls of the imperial palace complex. For Caligula, these games represented the perfect platform to display his divine nature to the largest possible audience. Foreign ambassadors would be present, along with representatives from every major city in the empire. The events would be recorded by historians and celebrated in poetry, ensuring that accounts of his godlike magnificence would spread throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. The emperor had been planning his participation in the festival for months, commissioning new costumes that would allow him to appear as different gods on different days. One day he would be Jupiter, complete with artificial thunderbolts and a crown of golden laurel leaves. The next day he would transform into Apollo, carrying a golden lyre and wearing robes that shimmered like sunlight. Each appearance would be carefully choreographed to demonstrate a different aspect of his divine nature. He had also planned to use the festival to announce new religious reforms that would formalize his worship throughout the empire. Temples dedicated to his cult would be built in every major city, staffed by priests who would conduct daily services in his honor. Citizens would be required to offer morning prayers to his divine image before beginning their daily activities. The old gods would not be abandoned, but they would be subordinated to the newest and greatest deity, Caligula himself. For the conspirators, the Ludi Palatini represented the ideal opportunity they had been waiting for. The festival's schedule was fixed by tradition and could not be changed without causing offense to important guests. The events would take place in familiar locations where they could position themselves in advance. Most importantly, the emperor would be required to move between different venues according to a predictable timetable, creating the kind of routine vulnerability that his usual paranoia prevented. During the days the games lasted, Caligula's behavior became more erratic than ever, as if the excitement of public performance had accelerated his psychological disintegration. He joined actors on stage during theatrical performances, singing and dancing with an abandon that shocked even audiences accustomed to his eccentricities. He forced senators to applaud his ridiculous performances, threatening them with treason charges if their enthusiasm seemed insufficient. On the second day of the festival, he appeared in the arena dressed as a gladiator and demanded to fight against condemned criminals. The crowd watched in horrified fascination as their god emperor struggled with rusted weapons against opponents who were too terrified to defend themselves effectively. When he emerged victorious from these rigged contests, he declared that he had proven his divine valor and demanded that temples be built to commemorate his gladiatorial achievements. But it was his theatrical performances that revealed the depths of his delusion. He would interrupt plays to correct actors who he felt were misrepresenting the gods, sometimes taking over their roles entirely and performing elaborate soliloquies about his own divine nature. These performances could last for hours, with the audience trapped in their seats while the emperor worked through increasingly bizarre improvisations. The night before his death, Caligula experienced what witnesses described as a prophetic dream that seemed to shake even his confidence in his own invincibility. He dreamed that he stood before the throne of Jupiter on Mount Olympus, demanding to be recognized as an equal by the king of the gods. Jupiter listened to his arguments with apparent patience, then responded with a gesture of contempt that sent Caligula tumbling back to earth like a falling star. He woke screaming, his body covered in sweat, despite the cool January air. For hours, he paced his chambers, alternately raging against Jupiter's ingratitude and trying to convince himself that the dream was a test of his faith rather than a prophecy of doom. He consulted the palace's auguries, priests trained in reading divine omens, who confirmed his worst fears. The omens for January 24th were uniformly terrible. The priests read signs of death and violence in every ritual they performed. The sacrificial animals revealed organs marked with dark spots that indicated divine displeasure. The flights of birds formed patterns associated with the fall of kings. Even the household gods seemed to be turning their faces away from their supposed divine colleague. The date itself carried ominous significance in Roman superstition. It fell during the period of the year when the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead was thought to be thinnest, when spirits could cross between dimensions, and when mortal affairs were most vulnerable to supernatural intervention. It was not an auspicious day for a man who claimed to be a god to test his immortality. Moreover, an oracle consulted years earlier had given Caligula a warning that had haunted him ever since: beware of Cassius. In his arrogance and paranoia, he had interpreted this as a reference to Gaius Cassius Longinus, a wealthy senator whose family name connected him to the assassins of Julius Caesar. Caligula had spent considerable energy monitoring Longinus, restricting his movements, and ensuring that he never had access to weapons or opportunities. He never suspected that the prophecy might refer to Cassius Chaerea, the man he humiliated daily with his crude jokes about passwords and virility. The possibility that his greatest threat might come from within his own guard, from a man he considered beneath his notice, never occurred to an emperor who believed that his divine nature made him immune to mortal dangers. The conspirators had finalized their plan with the precision of a military campaign, understanding that they would have only one chance to succeed. Their strategy depended entirely on exploiting Caligula's daily routine during the festival, particularly his habit of leaving the theatre at midday to return to his private quarters for lunch and a bath. The route he would take was predetermined by the architecture of the Palatine complex. To avoid the crowds of spectators who filled the public areas, he would use a narrow underground passage known as the Cryptoporticus, a tunnel that connected the theatre to the residential sections of the palace. This passage was poorly lit, cramped, and most importantly, too narrow for his full Germanic guard to surround him effectively. In the confined space of the tunnel, the barbarian warriors who served as his personal protection would be forced to travel in single file, unable to form the protective formation that made them so formidable in open areas. If the conspirators could isolate the emperor from his guards, even for a few seconds, they would have their opportunity to strike. Chaerea and Sabinus, as tribunes of the guard with legitimate duties during the festival, would have perfect excuses to be present in the tunnel. They could position themselves along the route and control access to ensure that their fellow conspirators could reach the emperor when the moment came. Their official status would prevent anyone from questioning their presence until it was too late to matter. The other conspirators, senators and knights who lacked official security roles, would blend into the crowd of festival attendees near the theatre's exits. They would wait for the predetermined signal, then converge on the tunnel entrance to overwhelm any guards who might try to interfere with the assassination. Each man carried a concealed dagger, hidden beneath the flowing folds of his toga in the traditional Roman manner. The signal would be simple and unmistakable: Chaerea's first strike against the emperor. Once blood was drawn, there would be no possibility of retreat or negotiation. Every conspirator would be committed to seeing the assassination through to completion, understanding that failure would mean not just their own deaths, but the deaths of their families and associates as well. January 24th arrived with unseasonable warmth that seemed to mock the dark purpose of the day. The conspirators took their positions with the calm professionalism of soldiers preparing for battle, their faces showing none of the tension that churned in their stomachs. Each man had made his peace with the likelihood that he would not survive the day, understanding that some causes were worth dying for even when success seemed impossible. They carried their concealed daggers with the familiarity of men who had trained extensively for this moment. These weren't ceremonial weapons or tools of convenience. They were purpose-built instruments of assassination, their blades sharpened to razor edges, their hilts wrapped in leather for secure gripping even when hands were slick with blood and sweat. But as the morning progressed and the moment of truth approached, their carefully laid plans began to encounter the unpredictability that made Caligula such a dangerous target. Contrary to his established routine, the emperor announced that he felt too unwell to leave the theatre for his usual midday meal. He would remain in his seat and continue watching the performances, disrupting the timetable that the conspiracy depended on. Panic began to spread through the ranks of the conspirators as they realized that their opportunity was slipping away. The plan had been designed around the emperor's predictable movements, and without that predictability, they had no way to reach him through his protective barrier of guards and attendants. If the festival ended without providing them with an opportunity to strike, they might never get another chance. Worse, the longer they waited in position, the more likely it became that their nervous behavior would attract attention from the very security forces they were trying to circumvent. Palace guards were trained to notice unusual patterns, unexpected gatherings, and suspicious behavior. Too many men lingering in the wrong places for too long would eventually trigger an investigation that could expose the entire conspiracy. The tension was becoming unbearable when salvation came from an unexpected source. Marcus Vinicius and Claudius, two of the highest-ranking conspirators, made the desperate decision to approach the emperor directly and convince him to follow his normal routine. It was an enormous risk. Any suspicion on Caligula's part would doom them all, but they had no alternative except to abandon the assassination entirely. They approached the imperial box with the casual confidence of men who belonged in such elevated company, their expressions showing nothing but concern for the emperor's comfort and well-being. Years of experience in the treacherous waters of imperial politics had taught them to control their facial expressions and body language even under the most extreme pressure. "Caesar," Vinicius said, with the practiced deference that had kept him alive through 3 different reigns, "the heat in the theatre is becoming quite oppressive. Perhaps your divine person would benefit from some refreshment and a brief respite in the cooler air of your private chambers." Claudius, despite his reputation for stammering and social awkwardness, managed to add his own persuasive voice to the appeal. "The afternoon performances will be even more spectacular, my lord. You'll want to be at your best to appreciate the tribute that the artists are preparing in your honor." For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Caligula studied their faces with the suspicious intensity that had become his trademark. His eyes, which courtiers described as having an unsettling quality that made it difficult to maintain eye contact, moved back and forth between the 2 senators, as if he were trying to read their thoughts directly from their expressions. The conspirators, who could observe this interaction from their positions around the theatre, felt their hearts stop as they watched their fate being decided by an emperor whose paranoia had reached levels that bordered on supernatural intuition. If he suspected anything, if some instinct warned him that these men were not what they appeared to be, the entire conspiracy would unravel in seconds. Finally, with a gesture of apparent boredom rather than suspicion, Caligula stood from his imperial seat. The decision seemed to be based on comfort rather than any deeper consideration. The sun had indeed grown quite warm, and the prospect of a cool bath, followed by a leisurely meal in private chambers, had obvious appeal to a man who was accustomed to having every desire instantly gratified. "Very well," he said, his voice carrying the casual authority of someone who had never been denied anything he wanted. "The performances have grown somewhat tedious anyway. Perhaps the afternoon will offer more worthy entertainment." The conspirators felt a collective surge of relief so intense that several of them had to grip nearby pillars or walls to avoid collapsing from the sudden release of tension. Their plan was back on track, their opportunity restored by the emperor's own decision to follow the routine that would lead him to his death. Caligula began making his way toward the exit that led to the cryptoporticus, moving with the unhurried pace of a man who had no reason to fear for his safety. His Germanic guards fell into their protective formation around him, their hands resting casually on their weapon hilts, but showing no signs of unusual alertness. As far as they were concerned, this was just another routine movement within the secure confines of the palace complex. The procession moved through the theatre's corridors like a small parade, with the emperor at its center surrounded by the massive barbarian warriors who served as his personal protection. Palace staff and visiting dignitaries pressed themselves against the walls to allow the imperial party to pass, bowing their heads in the traditional gesture of respect for the divine emperor. As they approached the entrance to the tunnel, Cheria felt his heart begin to race with a combination of anticipation and terror that he had not experienced since his first battle as a young legionary. This was the moment he had been planning for months, the opportunity to strike back at the man who had systematically destroyed his dignity and self-respect, but it was also likely to be the last few minutes of his life. The cryptoporticus stretched ahead of them like a throat waiting to swallow its victims. The tunnel was perhaps 8 feet wide and 12 feet high, its walls lined with marble panels that gleamed dully in the light of oil lamps mounted at regular intervals. The floor was smooth stone that showed every footprint, every drop of moisture that condensed from the cool air underground. In this confined space, everything would change. The Germanic guards, who were so formidable in open areas where they could use their size and reach to maximum advantage, would be constrained by the tunnel's dimensions. They would have to move in single file, unable to form the protective barrier that made them nearly invincible under normal circumstances. Caligula entered the tunnel with the confidence of a man who had never been seriously threatened, chatting casually with the attendants who accompanied him about the morning's entertainment and the afternoon's planned activities. He seemed completely unaware that he was walking into the most dangerous few minutes of his life, that every step was bringing him closer to a confrontation that would determine not just his own fate, but the future of the Roman Empire. About halfway through the passage, he encountered a group of young Greek actors who were waiting to perform in the afternoon's theatrical presentations. These were skilled performers who had been brought to Rome specifically for the festival, artists whose talents had earned them the privilege of appearing before the divine emperor himself. The encounter was perfectly natural and innocent. The actors were using the tunnel to move between different areas of the palace complex, just as the emperor was doing, but their presence provided exactly the kind of distraction that the conspirators needed to make their approach without arousing suspicion. Caligula was genuinely fascinated by their craft and eager to discuss the finer points of theatrical performance with artists who shared his passion for dramatic presentation. He stopped to engage them in conversation, asking about their training, their previous performances, and their plans for the afternoon's entertainment. His enthusiasm for the arts was one of the few genuinely positive aspects of his personality that had survived his transformation into a tyrant. For several minutes, the emperor stood absorbed in conversation with the young actors, his attention completely focused on their discussion of music and drama. His guards remained alert but relaxed, watching the approaches to the tunnel while their master indulged his artistic interests. It was exactly the kind of moment the conspirators had hoped for, the emperor distracted and vulnerable, his protection focused on external threats rather than internal ones. Charia approached from behind, his footsteps silent on the smooth stone floor of the tunnel. Years of military training had taught him to move with deadly quiet when necessary, and he used every skill he had learned to close the distance between himself and his target, without alerting the Germanic guards to his presence. His hand found the hilt of his concealed sword, a weapon he had chosen specifically for this moment. It wasn't a dagger like those carried by his fellow conspirators. It was a full legionary gladius, the short sword that had conquered most of the known world in the hands of Roman soldiers. He had served with this blade for 20 years, had killed enemies of Rome with it on a dozen battlefields, and now he would use it to kill the greatest enemy Rome had ever produced from within its own ranks. The weight of the weapon in his hand was familiar and comforting, a reminder of all the times it had saved his life and helped him serve his duty to the empire. This would be its greatest service, the blow that would free Rome from a tyrant who had perverted everything the empire was supposed to represent. As he drew closer to his target, Charia could hear Caligula's voice discussing the technical aspects of theatrical music with the Greek performers. The emperor was completely absorbed in the conversation, gesticulating enthusiastically as he made points about rhythm and melody. He seemed more human in this moment than he had in months, more like the promising young ruler he had been before power and madness had corrupted him.